are different movements in Chicago in terms of people in the city and the changing city as far as immigrants finding homes in the city to work in the industries, in terms of adequate housing, vocational skills. There were places like the Hull House that was a social settlement, which was not a unique entity to Chicago. But it started out in an old house just west of the city that actually had been a very exclusive house in the early days of Chicago, kind of out in the country. Mm-hmm. But around it became one of the most crowded and troubled immigrant neighborhoods in the city in terms of housing quality, sanitation. And Jane Addams and Ellen Gates Starr in 1889 basically took part of this old home, opened the door, and people were invited to come in. And it expanded into where people could kind of come in, experience this house. As it expanded, it had places where you could see and learn about the other cultures of people who lived in the neighborhood, but also things that would be in terms of things like wood shops, weaving, craft, art, cafeteria with good food.
To train them? To train.
Yeah. But it was never done in a way that was preachy or teachy and say, this is what you should do. It was not about becoming Americanized. Mm-hmm. It was about recognizing and having confidence in yourself as a person.
Empowering people?
Empowering people. But also empowering them with a sense and a pride, not only themselves, but their own heritage and where they came from. And so in a neighborhood where you had people from many different nationalities who were poor, they did not have access to many resources, it would still give you the idea of personal pride in where you came from. And where in many circles in Chicago where the ethnic community, nobody was interested in where you came from or what the culture was. At Hull House, these things were shared. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, you would kind of discover things that would be that you might want to do as a vocation or devote yourself to. So it was all about self-discovery and empowerment.
Which is rather different from the one, from what I understood from the one I was talking about in France, which was more about making sure that those people were clean, making sure that they're not going to spend their money on alcohol, making sure, it was designing them more than empowering them. I get
but to some extent, that's what they were doing at Hull House, but it wasn't, in some ways, the way that message was brought across was more subtle and by self-discovery. I think one of the hallmarks of Chicago thought that works into almost every aspect of its culture and its art is the respect and the power of the individual and empowerment and developing a sense of confidence for people to express themselves as individuals for the shared benefit of society as a whole.
So that you would say is part of the spirit of Chicago?
Part of the spirit of Chicago. In terms of architecture, there are architects who designed many of these settlement houses, named the Pond Brothers. And they had a very distinctive name. And if you asked somebody in Chicago in 1910, let's say you went to a national convention of architects outside of Chicago, you'd say, well, what is Chicago known for? Somebody not from Chicago would say, well, it is a home of kind of unconventional thoughts and ideas in architecture. And if you asked who are the leading practitioners who would do that, they would probably mention Louis Sullivan. They would likely mention Frank Lloyd Wright. And they would probably mention the Pond Brothers. Nobody remembers the Pond Brothers. But they did and all were approaching what was a vital contemporary architecture. The Pond Brothers built what did buildings that they called a builded beauty. the integrity of a brick wall being made out of things that are manufactured by a person into a brick, laid by hand. So the
means of productions were important to them.
Yeah, that each one of them represented the human hand and labor, and the idea of the brick itself. So you enhance the brick wall and make it beautiful. You pattern it in a way through the skill of the brick masons.
I bet theater was like that.
It is, but nobody remembers these men.
Yeah.
And they actually were able to move very comfortably in social circles. In fact, what was interesting with Hull House is that many of the established business people in Chicago looked upon the women that ran Hull House as being these radicals, and even possibly threatening the whole system. But the spouses of the millionaires, many of them really embraced the Hull House and would go and would volunteer there, and actually would, I think, very quietly then go home and
work it out.
Work it out, and in some ways, it trickled into the sensibility, I think, of the kind of the big business leaders. Now, it's interesting to talk about the big business leaders of Chicago in the late 19th century, because these are all people who came here not that long before and basically worked and hustled and developed their fortune by ingenuity, creativity, and then suddenly they make a lot of money, and partially because there's many people who did things differently that nobody thought of before in this kind of open forum, and made a lot of money. Then these are the people that you often will see if you go to the History Museum, and there they are in the gold frame, and they're in their fancy coats and whatnot. But if you go to their origins of how they got the money, they were out there scrapping and fighting and whatnot. But once they made it,
so it's not like inherited noble money. It's like
it's new money.
It's
new money.
Nouveau riche.
Yeah, and in some cases, in some of the architecture, it manifests as trying to say, okay, now I've got all this money. How am I going to show everyone that I have this money? So that, in the way that manifested itself in architecture, goes many different ways. There were people who just followed fashion, and they would look to what they would see in the architectural magazines. And I would say, through the time of the Great Chicago Fire, which kind of leveled Chicago in 1871, their architecture was not that remarkable or what you would have different from what you'd see in other cities. And ironically, after the fire, the city rebuilt very quickly with the same kind of unremarkable buildings. They wanted to show they could build in. The one thing that the fire didn't destroy was Chicago's perfect location, where all the rail lines and the water transit met. Many people who saw out east, and here was this young upstart Chicago, and now it's just leveled. And they said, well, I wonder if that's going to see if the city will regenerate itself. Well, of course it did, because it was such a critical commerce point. So it rebuilt quickly. But it built itself up with, 4 and 5 story buildings that looked like buildings you'd find anywhere else. But one of the things that came that happened after the Chicago fire is you had to now rebuild a whole major city. And many people who were architects out east saw that this was a place where you could actually get some work and an opportunity. So many of them came to Chicago in the aftermath of the Chicago fire. Louis Sullivan tells the story of coming to Chicago. He was born in Boston. He briefly trained at what's the beginnings of MIT. Went to work in Philadelphia, and then gets fired in the Great Depression of the 1870s. Comes to Chicago, and the story he writes that he stepped off the train, and he saw the city still partially in ruins, and he said he stomped his foot and he raised his hand and said, "This is the place for me." And this was the kind of place for somebody who was a dreamer. Now, you'll often hear stories of Louis Sullivan, and say how he was trying to create deliberately a new American architecture.
Mm-hmm.
People will say he was trying to create a modern architecture.
Mm-hmm.
People will say that he invented the skyscraper.
Mm-hmm.
None of that is true. It is.
Cut.
It is true. It is all true, but not as a deliberate action to say, I am going to make an American architecture. I am going to make a modern architecture.
Mm-hmm.
The skyscraper was something that evolved. That's a little other story. But Sullivan came with ideas, and he was very typical of what you had as architect who was a dreamer in a way. Very practical. Now, one thing about Sullivan that I think sets him apart, he had amazing gifts of the mind. And I would say you would call him, his mind worked like a human Google.
Okay.
He was able to assimilate everything that he learned or saw and get it in, and he could then synthesize things quickly as a thought. Not everybody can do this, but he had that. He also was very much taken with the concepts of transcendental thought and the relationship of people to nature, and the idea that human beings are part of nature with the ability to think, to reason, and the ability to create. And Sullivan's idea, an ideal, was that you could train your mind in such a way that you can, by thinking creatively, taking the passions of your heart and expression combined with your knowledge of technology, building, to be able to actually become an extension of nature and give life to things that don't have life. Mm-hmm. So you can make a building that is in some ways alive. Just like something in nature, all of the component parts are there for a reason. They have part of it that becomes part of how a plant will grow and thrive.
So that's a very classical idea. It's the mimesis thing, right?
Yes, it's something that was even talked about very much, and Sullivan was very taken with Walt Whitman and Ralph. But it all goes back to, it's not a new concept. But then the whole idea is that people also are people who have their own passions and their feeling and their sensibilities. And so the idea was that if you are an architect, you will recognize the nature of the materials you're working with. You will realize the context of the area where you are building. You will recognize the function that the building is supposed to do. And you take these into account. But you also then work your own personal feelings of how to be the manipulator of space. And part of your tools as an architect is know how to use space, light, and motion to stir human reaction. Just as a human will react to something in nature, a beautiful tree, which of course is in relationship to the forest and the ground around it, you see it and you go, Sullivan's idea was that the building would be useful, practical, but also filled with power and passion that plays with your senses. Sullivan did this effortlessly in his mind, but he did it, and I think this is very, very much special gifts that he had. And the idea was that each human being would be their own conduit for this kind of. And so if each person individually has their own storehouse of knowledge of architecture, design, and building, combines it with their own sensibilities, that in terms of its time, its environment, and all aspects, they will create something that is their own interpretive version of this. So his ideal was that every person has the ability to do this. As an architect, you can do it. It can apply to literature. It can apply to... there's even stories of Sullivan telling the waiter at one of the clubs about how when he sets the table, it's an extension of himself. I mean, he was
serious about it.
Serious about it.
Question.
Now,
sorry.
sure.
No, go ahead. No, I get the feeling that you're aiming
But
towards
here's the
something.
point.
Yeah.
Was he trying to create a modern architecture? What is modern architecture? It's just a term. It's a thing.
Yeah.
And if you're trying to aim for something modern or different, what does that mean? What is the what kind of depth? No, he was not. But a vital modern, what we could call a modern interpretation, is the natural result of that process.
So like a how do you say, the zeitgeist sort of thing? Or
Yes.
Yeah.
And so that would be, was it to generate an American architecture? No. This was a philosophy that would apply not only to Chicago or just the United States, but anywhere.
But one would already have to have the freedom to not think that architecture has to be the copy of the masters, or what he would have to. He would have to already be freed from a tradition to be able to conceive things in such.
He had hoped to make a compelling case with his writings and with his buildings. And even the idea with Sullivan's buildings is that anybody walking down the street who knows nothing about architecture or engineering or the relationship of or any of this, would see one of the buildings and go, oh, you would notice it. It would play upon you like a fine piece of music. So it's playing the same way that music or literature would go. And it impresses you. But the more you know about architecture and technology and design and what the physical components of a building need to be, what the requirements of the use are, you would see that it all relates together. So the more you look at it and the more you know, you can see the logic and the sensibility. Now, it is romantic abstraction. So it's not a literal, bare bones model. But it all makes sense in terms of its time and its technology.
So let's try. I'm going to try to make it a little tricky here.
Okay.
I'm a bit like not at ease most of the time when we talk about architecture as architects, and because every time architecture is about like some very smart guy who comes on a white horse, and he has all this, it's all about one person that's gonna suddenly unveil a new reality or something. Whereas if you take history of clothing, for instance, every time it's more like, black at this moment in society means this, or this form in society at this moment. It's not about one designer that would appear. So, when you were saying, for instance, you were talking about the people making money, deciding how am I going to show off. For instance, there's that book, like that Weber book, the Protestant Ethics and the Spirit of Capitalism, in which he says, okay, Protestant people will acquire money through the doctrine of predestination because they have to succeed in what they do, but then they will not show off, it generates capital, but then they also have a particular set of objects that they wear, like their clothes will not be like the Ancien Régime clothes, they will be very... so the forms that they display on themselves are like ideological flags somehow. And so the architecture also is austere somehow. The Protestant architecture is not like fireworks, or it's like So what would you think is if we were to set aside the great characters of history like Sullivan, or which of course play their part, How would you read? What if? But maybe you might refute to see architecture in those terms, and I'd be interested to see why. But would you think like the architecture of Chicago would embody a particular kind of ideology that would be? So is it entrepreneurial? Like Tafuri, when he was talking about Chicago, he was saying about New York, he was saying this is the three-dimensionalization of capital, for instance. Mm-hmm. Or so how would you see because the entrepreneurial guys, like apparently you were saying you used the term showing off, so they would not be Protestants. Like was their main? Were they Puritans, or was it like a fragmented chaos of different ideologies? Or
Chicago didn't have. I mean, we talk about Sullivan, and you talk about many of the new thoughts and movements as manifest in buildings. That did not manifest itself all over the city. Mm-hmm. In fact, many of the buildings that were built by the major capitalists in Chicago were not going to Louis Sullivan. In fact, he built darn little.
Yeah.
And there are very specific circumstances where you can find where his jobs come from. Yeah. Many of the buildings, the homes, the buildings downtown are built by many of the business people, are actually looking to emulate styles that you would find in the East Coast to say we can keep up with this, or they are looking to Europe in this kind of sense of validation of a new city and new entrepreneurs and new money to look established and to be able to stand side by side. We do have an unusual case, and I think it tells a lot, that the architectural partnership of Burnham and Root, who were counterparts to Sullivan. And Root was kind of the dreamy architectural partner to Daniel Burnham. And Daniel Burnham, of course, is the one who was good at going with the millionaires and going to the fancy club, drinking brandy with them and whatnot. But they also came to Chicago after the fire. And I think this will give you an idea of how things would happen in Chicago, or how buildings are built. And John Welborn Root was really advocating what was a very different architecture than what would be fit into style. See, that's the one enemy there is the idea of style. Mm-hmm. There was an idea of design being more than set. It's being practicality, personal creativity, not all the style. Yeah. So Burnham and Root both came to Chicago. They were working for another architectural firm. They go off on their own. People weren't hiring them. They were watering the ink because they couldn't afford to buy ink. And then John Root, who was this kind of amazing character, he could play the piano and sing, and he was just absolutely charming, everyone that met him, marries the daughter of one of the big officials with one of the major railroads.
Okay.
Daniel Burnham marries the daughter of the man who runs the Union Stockyards in Chicago, one of the major industries. The stockyard economy becomes part of the larger banking community. So now, here they went from being the outsiders. And now you have people in the railroad, banking, stockyards community, the basic foundation, who want to build a big building in Chicago. Well, who do you give it to?
Yeah.
Why, give it to John Sherman's son-in-law, Daniel Burnham. And so you've got some really remarkable buildings that probably, had it not, they would have never been, the buildings would have been more traditional and following other styles. So here's a kind of, instead of walking in the front door, the creativity walked in the side door, and the pure forces of capitalism, influence, cronyism, gave them the chance to create actually some remarkable buildings. Sullivan never was that lucky to have that broad of a base. Of course, when John Welborn Root eventually dies at a very young age, just before the Columbian Exposition, Burnham actually was more susceptible to looking to classical and historical precedent, which probably his partner would have not embraced. Although, the other thing to say about all of these architects, to say that they were throwing away other previous styles of architecture, or even disregarding what was being built at the time, is absolutely not the case. Part of this whole idea is that you synthesize all of these things and you take what is vital of value from historical architecture and you use what is appropriate. So there is historical precedent and inspirations that come from classicism, contemporary architecture, even aspects of outward decoration or style, where there are some that becomes part of your toolbox to be able to creatively develop from. So that's what they were trying to do. No one person was trying to be the mastermind and say, this is what you do. And it never was do a building that looks like mine.
Yeah. Oh.
It was complete. I mean, Sullivan would be furious about that. He had a draftsman. Sullivan had a draftsman who decided he was going to please Sullivan, and he works on a drawing, and he duplicates the ornament, and he shows it to Sullivan. He says, I bet you think I'm going to say this is pretty good. He says, and this man's name is John Demuth. That's not John Demuth. He says, that's John Demuth trying to be Louis Sullivan. He says, if you had shown me John Demuth trying to be John Demuth, and show, even if you were just in the process of finding yourself and it's not fully put together, I would be respectful and in admiration and encouraging.
So so you said, we were just going off camera, we were discussing, I was asking you whether this city had been historically a right-wing or a left-wing city. You were saying, like, somehow, like, most likely, I think.
Well, here, it's interesting between kind of the political mindset of it. It was a city of, I think, many renegade people, and even the people who became the established business people by the late 19th century came from a pretty freewheeling, and they were hustling and whatnot. And I think that spirit of kind of improvisation, ingenuity, and in some cases irreverence, or the courage to be irreverent, is very much part of the Chicago mindset. Now, you did get where many of the same captains of industry in Chicago, and ones who were building many of the big buildings and the clients, as they became successful, and they were merging their financial success as part of the big American capital system, that many of them ended up taking a very conservative viewpoints, particularly in terms of how labor is dealt with. So, of course, we have the infamous Haymarket incident of 1886. And in some cases in many cases you have strong aspects of intolerance, lack of respect, suppression of labor, and so that's very much there. So, and it's very conservative, and it actually manifested itself in some very.
So where would then that sort of left-wing tone come from?
The left wing, it's almost the case of when I talk about the architecture not being a deliberate attempt to be modern, or not a deliberate attempt to.
As a consequence,
it's kind of just evolved as part of this city that was a place that you would land in, using your own wits and your.
Like, because it's a harbor, does it act as a harbor? Like in Marseille, for instance, or like in France, there are parts of the cities where there's a lot of foreigners that arrive. That makes it a very particular kind of environment.
Definitely the infusion of new people. Actually, one of the interesting things about Chicago is new people coming. And even though I think even some of the the large business people and the captains of industry would question how much the introduction of other cultures impacted their lives and their business, I think it did have an effect overall on the city as far as it not being basically an old, it really establishing an old society in a way. It still had the origins, even the business people had some of the origins of their rebelliousness and creativity that comes through. And the other thing about Chicago is, it's this influx of new people coming, and they come from different places at different times. So you can even detect changes in the shifts of the outlooks of the city in general by different groups who have predominated and become part of the political structure and the social structure. And one of the interesting things is that I think the vitality of the city was people coming. And also as people coming and going. In fact, you had people who would come here. They would do something that was different or innovative. In some cases, it was looked upon outside of Chicago, some radical idea in be it technology or design or whatever. People would even maybe perhaps laugh at it and say, look what they're doing in Chicago. And then people would succeed. And there's even cases later in Chicago where you would even find this in literature, I know, for example, where you would have people who were writers that were doing, very different style, and a very personal, visceral way of writing. It was very individual. And people would look at that, and sometimes outside in the fine literature, what's this? They would succeed, and then off they'd go to New York.
Yeah, okay.
And then suddenly, they wind up, they've impacted the old society by what, and this is what happened with the architecture.
Yeah. So it was like a launching
pad. And people would sometimes say, oh, well, gee, here's somebody, they go off to New York.
Yeah.
Well, that's just fine, because they may be going off to New York. That's fine. There's somebody coming in to Chicago.
That's going to replace it.
Going to replace it. And it's that kind of keep going and leapfrog in a way.
Yeah, I think, because I don't know where this is going, but I think I'm trying to say, in the same way that Weber was saying there's a spirit of capitalism, I'm trying to say, and you used the term several times, what would be the spirit of Chicago? And I think that's what you're sort of saying, like people coming and going. But so, if there was such a spirit of Chicago, how do you think, would there be built manifestations of this, besides this, what you've been saying, if I understand correctly, is that everybody would do something different, or everybody would try something, and do you think the city would be reflected as this? But like for instance, is it a union city, or has there been or is it like Detroit? Like, have there been like strong socialist movements?
Yes.
What would be the like psychoanalytical understanding of what this city is? What's behind the stones that would talk about it?
One of the major impacts in Chicago as it evolved in the 19th century, which is kind of the critical crucible of Chicago's identity, was German immigration to Chicago. And Chicago had a very sizable German community. And I think a large part in the German community, where you had the origins of many movements in terms of labor, social change, unions, organizing in the city and trying to assert their voice, including many very challenging ideas of labor, society, capital that were considered to be very threatening. To not only in Chicago, but threatening
the establishment.
The idea, for example, in Pullman in 1894, the attempt to do a nationwide railroad strike.
Yeah.
which would, in the context of that time, if you could have a nation, one big shutdown of the railroads,
that was scary.
You've shut down the country.
Yeah.
And so there were these things. So Chicago was a cruise, and there were certainly conflicts with it. And the German community is not alone in this. There were many others. But also, with the German immigration to Chicago, it had its impact on the built environment of Chicago, because it brought to Chicago many people who had technical training.
Yeah.
There were not places in the United States of any sizable number that gave you detailed technical training, but there was in Europe with the special technical school. And many of the German immigrants came with technical expertise that was critical to make things like the skyscraper possible. How to determine the foundation for the skyscraper. That would be from a German immigrant. And also the whole technology of how to build and the strengths of materials and the compatibility of materials being combined. One of the things you have that's interesting in Chicago is the late 19th century comes of age an architecture built of manufactured materials rather than just basically masonry, wood, right? But you have things like for a skyscraper, the combination of materials, so a supporting metal frame, a protective masonry cladding to protect it against the weather and fire. And how you combine these materials and how you make it survive in a complicated climate of freeze and thaw. Things about developing elevators from just a technology that existed of just slow-moving into an entire bank of fast-moving elevators. That needed to figure out, and that technical expertise had to be
brought in.
And it almost brought in instantaneously. One of the things about Chicago, we didn't even get into, maybe this is going off point here, is after the Chicago fire, they rebuilt the whole city like it was before. 4- and 5-story buildings. They didn't have elevators for the most part. You walked up the stair. The higher you went, the cheaper the rent. And the cheaper the finishes. And if, of course, people wonder, well, gee, what would be the impact of the fire? Would Chicago regrow itself? So it rebuilt itself almost instantly, even though there was a depression going on. So here's a whole new city, just like the city that was there before. But people kept coming. And the very nature of the commerce in the central location. So now more people wanted to have their offices in the central business district. And unlike other cities, that as the cities grow, you could grow sideways and absorb smaller areas around it. Downtown Chicago was locked in by the river, by the lake, by the railroads, by commercial collars that went around the waterways for commerce. So the area...
Like Paris?
Yes. Well, but the area for business couldn't expand sideways. And so now there is a demand for taller buildings. And so you have the real estate people and the bankers and the landowners goading the architects and the engineers to figure out how to build a tall building. That's why it happened.
Is that documented?
That's why it happened here.
So
New York didn't have the need to build that kind of a building because it could still there was areas
to expand.
Here you really couldn't. You didn't want to disrupt the industrial collar around the waterways. That was the warehouses and the factories.
They needed the water.
And there was areas that were, the center for. So there's where the need for a tall building. And so it was so then you have to not only how to design it technically, And some of the early skyscrapers, it's interesting, as they were trying to figure it out. They were afraid of the height.
Yeah.
And so you would design it like every few floors, it would be like several little small buildings stacked on top. Maybe if you do that, nobody will notice it's tall. And then you start getting the people who are more the dreamers, who then come in and try to give an aesthetic form that would recognize the inherent geometry of the metal frame, but also romanticize the height. Louis Sullivan didn't invent the skyscraper. He didn't get it to do one until fairly late in the game. But he was one of those that taught the skyscraper how to soar.
Yeah.
It's all romantic abstraction.
But I would say, then I'd like to go to a bit. I would like to ask you this will lean towards a question about what architecture is as an anthropological phenomenon. Because I get the feeling that architects always their real true function is to give an acceptable form to new capacities. If you say like Le Corbusier would say there hasn't been any real architecture since, I don't know, like the antiquity or whatever. But what he's doing, the engineers have been doing it like with systematic building out of so it's all been there. What he does, he actually he takes those forms and puts them into whether it's the modular system, or he puts those forms back into a vocabulary that is acceptable. Right? I would get the feeling that the constraint make the building rise up, but they will antiquity did not build such kind of building, so there was no vocabulary for it. And so there's that Hunt building, which looks like a blown up. I don't know if you know the building.
Yes.
It looks like a blown up Haussmannian building in
yes.
which, So you just try to make it look like acceptable, that it's architectural, that is, and so then, if I understand correctly, to very caricature a bit, but Sullivan makes it look like a column, right?
Well, sure. And he doesn't deny the idea of column. But it also, think of let's take it back a little ways. Think of a column and how a classical column roots to the ground, tapers up, blossoms to...
You would still have
this... It is a fundamental nature form. Is translated into an architectural type. And with Sullivan, he knew, and the idea of a skyscraper, you can look and you can make the comparison of a Sullivan skyscraper to a classical column. And that wasn't lost on him either, but it goes down, actually this is the part that people don't talk about. The overall fundamental form of most Sullivan skyscrapers is a giant abstraction of the relationship of a living tree or plant, rooted to the ground, this defined base, rises up to the sky, blossoms at the top.
Which is the basic metaphor of even of classical architecture.
It's in classical architecture in general. So it's the same idea, but the whole difference of what the idea was. Now, we can argue how successful people were in making this reality or to spread, how much of it is rhetoric and how much of it is real. That's it.
Post-rationalization or whatever.
So, but there was a very deliberate idea of making a very personal, emotional abstraction of building, and that each person is a conduit for that. If you can get, in an ideal sense, and this is asking a lot, this is saying that people had that same human Google mind that Sullivan had. I mean, there's even aspects of that you can debate. But if you can develop a society that has that same appreciation for the power of the individual, summoning the powers of the mind, and to be able to create and use out of yourself, using as your palette everything that's out there in terms of technology, environment, what a building, and each person does it individually. A vital architecture will be the natural result. And style, although there is an outward character, it's not about style, and it's not style to be emulated. People copied Sullivan, furious. But if in the ideal sense, if you went by this, and again, is this a reasonable thing to expect to actually be put into practice? That we can debate. But if everyone thinks and everyone adapts as times change and technology changes or different areas are dealt with, a vital, creative, modern architecture will be the natural result in perpetuity. That was the ideal. It's asking a lot.
No, I think I get it. I think there's a, and then after maybe we need to go and see the city.
Yes.
But I have one big question, and that's going to be it's going to be difficult to maybe really get back to architecture. Going back to clearly politics, I think. It seems to me, being a tourist, and that the conception of socialism or left seem to be much more rooted in the individual, than as a unionized or leveled the people. You see what I'm saying? That it would still be funded whether people unite and coagulate as a force of progressive. It would still be very much rooted in the individuals. Not that the individual would not get dissolved in the whole. That it would still be an individual.
Individual strong, yes.
So, just an anecdote. I went to the jazz festival, Hyde Park, and I was given like a socialist sort of paper like this.
Sure.
And so the guy was filling in. It was a socialist form, socialist party form, and the guy was responding. The question was, what do you think about Obama's policy? And the guy was answering, I refuse the state. I refuse the... So I'm just trying to make this point because it's very complicated for me to understand why that might be off chart, but, for instance, Chomsky, or, anarcho-syndicalism, or the fact that very left-wing ideas could actually exist as very individual ideas and not common, because I think on the whole, I think this is architecture. The way people, you're talking about Sullivan, he gives, everything makes sense, or like it creates a system that is a model of a society, right? It's a metaphor for the individual. I would claim that the real work of the architect is to actually propose. It's not really about the building. It's really about what he thinks the order of the world ought to be, that it's a metaphor of, how we be, And so as a major discourse, he's providing a grand discourse, right?
Yes.
And embodying it through buildings as if they were models of the world order, sort of, little models of the world order. And so, but so the real architecture, what we talk about when we're architecture, is that order that is proposed. I would get, then it's only manifested through objects, whether it's buildings or rooms or... And I believe political organization is then architecture. How do we coagulate to one another? Like, what is... And I seem to... I have a hard time... I'm trying to struggle to understand what the left means in the U.S. You see?
Oh.
What's the relationship between the individual as a whole? It seems like it's a much more individualistic, not necessarily to put it in bad terms, but like individualistic left more than a gathering idea, unionized thing. Is it true, or like?
I think that is true, and I think you've got the sense of it. But what you have, and I think it's very strong in the country as a whole, and I'm not just talking about Chicago, but in the labor movements and other, and this filters into other aspects of social organizations and kind of a broad perspective, there is a strong emphasis on the individual, and that's very much. And the idea is but it's always a strength of the individual and a body of people of individuals, reinforcing the idea of a ideal whole as a society working together. So the power of the individual is the thing that if you have a society of people who are strong individuals, it makes a strong, cohesive society in that bond.
So
and
we the people, right? It's not mainly the people, it's the sum of individuals that do the people. Right?
Yes. I think that's, like I say, this is, I'm trying to
I know. I'm putting you in a tough spot.
But I mean, and it's certainly, and in Chicago, a lot of what we have in terms of the outlook that manifested itself in what we see are kind of creative movements is very much a part of that. So it's not necessarily the society as a whole working as an action, which I don't know that it really can anyway. I think it is. It is basically individual. But I think the nurturing the power of the individual is something that each individual has something to create, something to not to create, but to contribute. That people everyone has something to contribute in their own way, no matter what. And so the strong, cohesive society is the natural result. So it's all things about the individual creating a natural result rather than an objective.
I think I see what you're saying. Yeah. So now we're going to talk about Al Capone.
Al Capone.
You said you still have battery or like okay. You said you could tell us the real story about Al Capone. That I was starting saying that I heard that he was not such a big mafia guy that the world actually made a case of, or
yes,
what's the true story?
You look at movies and you see images of Al Capone, and there he is in palatial surroundings and he's running the whole Chicago. He's got control of everything in it. And, of course, if you think of, people think of gangster. If you said to somebody, draw a picture of a gangster, they will draw a kind of round-faced person with a big hat and a frock coat, and it's Al Capone. Okay. Now, it was illegal to sell alcoholic beverages in the United States, and it kicks into 1919 and continues into the 1930s. Now there is certainly, that was a largely unpopular law, but it was United States law, and people, wanted, part of the culture in the society was to have a drink. And also you had an emerging society in the 1920s where you had the children of the immigrant families who were now who in the 19th century, who were coming of age and wanted to assert their own individuality, that breaking away from the old ethnic roots and finding their way. And this is the jazz age in Chicago. And so there also was, in some ways, almost like you rebel against your parents. There was a rebellion. So you still want to go out and drink and dance and jazz and whatnot. So a system needs to get worked out to move liquor throughout the city. Now, there were always, Chicago as a city of neighborhoods. And many neighborhoods had a very cohesive ethnic or social identity to them. Sometimes they were in conflict with each other. And there would be rivalries and even gang warfare and whatnot. And there's always the people in every neighborhood that everyone knows in a neighborhood. And they're kind of the tough guy. Well, the way it was worked out, and it was actually people who came from New York who came. Al Capone, came in from New York. He wasn't Chicago. And his person that preceded him was Johnny. He was from New York. They'd come in. So you need to move liquor across the city, and you need to move it through neighborhoods that haven't gotten along. And so the idea was, but it was this man named Johnny Torrio. He said, figure out who the tough guys are in every neighborhood. Everybody knows them. They go to the same church that the police do, and everything. Who are kind of the tough, cool guys? And you build a network throughout the neighborhoods and say, okay, you make sure the liquor gets through your neighborhood. You get a cut of the money that you make from it. You can serve, and sets this whole network up. But according to the man Johnny Torrio, it was all about, just keep quiet. This is still illegal. Now,
so Johnny Torrio was the one.
He thought up this system of a network of tough guys. And he says, as long as you keep quiet and we do this, we can do this. And they even use their political influence and whatnot. And there were even things where, you knew everyone. So it was all neighborhood police precincts, so everyone kind of knew everyone. So your parents went to the same church. Anyway, Capone was this young tough, but he was street smart. How old do you think Al Capone was when he was... In his heyday, when he was supposedly running the city, he was 25 years old. It was all over as he entered his 30s. And these were all young toughs who were street smart. They suddenly wind up, and Capone kind of winds up, Johnny Torrio winds up getting shot, going into his house. Flees the city. Enough of that. So here this young kid, Al Capone, and he kind of liked to show off, and he loved to talk to the press. And where Torrio always said, shut up, don't call attention to yourself. Now, Capone was kind of this loose. It was a loose system. It never was that sophisticated or all. But he made himself even more of a figurehead. He lived in a little, modest, 2-story working neighborhood. He didn't even really have the desire to have a big house. It wasn't part of his upbringing. He grew up in a crowded tenement in New York.
Where was he living?
South side of Chicago. The house is not far from Theaster's place.
Okay. Well, we have to go check
7244 South Prairie. It's still there. I mean, on the block lived police, a retired Presbyterian minister. Isn't it? And so and the house is filled with Capone, his wife, his child, his brother, his brother's wife, his brother's child, an assortment of all living in this little tiny building. Now, he did have kind of a bigger house in Florida that he went to, but in Chicago, he lived in this spot. His headquarters, you see it in the movies. It's this grand place with crystal chandeliers. It was the dumpiest old hotel you could imagine. In fact, he didn't even occupy, except a small part of it, as his headquarters. The hotel was like a cheap hotel where traveling salespeople could get a cheap room and whatnot. And and as far as there being all these sophisticated tunnels and networks, all fabrication. And one of the reasons for that is Al Capone. This is the era of photojournalism. And it also, so this is when you could start
as a new thing?
Relatively new, that you could get a photograph in the paper.
Yeah.
And also, it was an era of what we often call kind of sensational journalism, where newspapers write sensational journalism. So now, here's Capone, and he'd talk to the press. What do you like to do in your spare time, Al? He'd have a cigar. With me, grand operas, the berries. Meaning grand operas. Well, then, of course, the newspapers loved it. So they put a picture of him, operas, the berries, says Al Capone, see, and say, and there'd be things, the press would talk about, why, they tried to hang everything on me but the Chicago fire. Press loved it. So his face and his name becomes synonymous with everything. But it's really this kind of loose, fragile empire that he's living in relatively modest circumstance. The cash flow, although there's a lot of money changing hands, cash flow wasn't that great. And he was just this really street smart kid. But he liked to show off. And then when it started, and also you had a society in the city of people who liked the idea of partying and liquor. The government's trying to take it away. The federal agents are the bad people. And you start having this warfare between the rival gangs where they start to shoot each other. And people started to look at the different gangsters whose pictures and faces would be in the paper, Capone and others. And it was almost like the Wild West. And many people kind of, in some ways, although people were getting murdered and gangsters were, people took kind of a vicarious interest in the thrill of living this life of these rivalries and the threat of, the vibe. And so it caught people's, and in some ways, they secretly admired the rebellion against the government system. But then it starts to escalate to the point where people are being gunned down on public streets. And I mean, there were even little books that were published of pictures of the gangsters, and you'd read it like, wow, here's, and they get these.
So there's a fascination
with it. But then when you start having it where people are being gunned down, like in a downtown street, and people realize, my husband or wife or mother could have been walking down that street. Things start to escalate out of control. Then it is decided that you need how to undo this. Who, by his own creation of the central figure of this, Al Capone, becomes the target and the symbol of it all, is Al Capone. And he gets sent away. But was he ever of the outward flamboyant? No. He was invented by the press. He was invented by a public rebelling against an unpopular law. And in the end, he gets put away for tax evasion. They had to figure out creative ways. Where did all your money come from? And
so he did have money.
He did have money, but it wasn't...
Yeah, it was not like
good clothes, fancy cars, and whatnot. But did he choose to live in grandeur in his house? No, he didn't. And, he in his house, there'd be this little worker's house, and he'd have fancy oriental carpets and gold frames and things on the wall. But So it's more an interesting phenomenon about what the U.S. does as generating, like engineering a new kind of persona or like a romanticization of crime or something than Capone himself? Yes, exactly. But he became the central figure because he was published a lot. He was colorful, and it was his own. Now, was a part of the organization of which he was someone do terrible things in terms of murder and crime, and absolutely, and there was but there's also cases of like in Chicago, ingenuity. And it's the same thing that you could apply to, say, the skyscraper and the engineers figuring out how to adapt materials and technologies to build a tall building. After World War I, the government had surplus machine guns. They didn't know what to do with them. You couldn't sell them. You couldn't hunt with them because whatever you would shoot at it would just blow it to pieces. And it took Chicagoans to say, well, we can buy these over the counter, and it might come in handy if there's even a building on the south side of Chicago where the first urban machine gunning was, where a guy buys one of these things. He doesn't know how to operate. He's kind of first one to think about buying one. And they're standing on the corner of this building. There was a drugstore on the ground floor and an apartment above. There standing on the corner was this guy who wasn't even necessarily one of his rivals, but he really wanted to test this thing out. Pulls up in the car, pulls the machine gun out, aims at the guy. He never handled a machine gun before.
Yeah, that's it.
shoots all the windows out of the building, shoots up the brick, doesn't hit the guy.
Yeah.
Nobody gets hurt. But
Yeah, that made some effect on him, I guess.
yeah. And there's one story they said that they interviewed the guy who was shot at because they couldn't figure out what happened. What would cause that kind of destruction that quickly?
Yeah,
And according to one thing, the guy said, well, I was okay. But he said that drugstore doesn't look like they run a sewing machine over it. There you go. It all kind of ties in.
Yeah. As some sort of, it's all accidents or something like that?
In some ways, it's happening. You had accidents and ingenuity, experimentation. You could take the story of the famous Chicago blues, for example, that everybody is talking. That's an influential force in music. And you had black migrants leaving the farms of the country areas of the Mississippi Delta that had very powerful, acoustically played music. Powerful rhythm, powerful music, powerful lyrics of life and sexually explicit of love and relationship. And it was typically played on acoustical guitars. And many of the musicians who started out from very poor made their own guitars, but they play them really hard. So now there is a kind of what do you call this? There's waves of migration in Chicago from different areas of African Americans to Chicago, and many of the people from the Mississippi Delta come to Chicago.
That would be another question.
1940s and 30s and 40s. And so the people who come from the Mississippi Delta area all kind of live in the same area because you live where there are people you know, and there are bars where are populated by people who are from the Delta. So you could hear familiar music. Well, now you're in a noisy bar. You've got your acoustical guitar. You can play it. You're not going to be heard. So then you buy electrical guitars. And you take that same power. And nobody's given them lessons on how to do an electric guitar. You get discord and fuzz and distortion, which all then becomes cultivated and gives that music even more power. So it's taking old southern Mississippi Delta powerful, explicit blues. By necessity, becomes electrified. And there you get the Chicago blues. It's the same idea. People coming from somewhere else, landing in the city, and through ingenuity and necessity, transforming something that exists into something. 1940s and 30s and 40s. And so the people who come from the Mississippi Delta area all kind of live in the same area because you live where there are people you know, and there are bars where are populated by people who are from the Delta. So you could hear familiar music. Well, now you're in a noisy bar. You've got your acoustical guitar. You can play it. You're not going to be heard. So then you buy electrical guitars. And you take that same power. And nobody's given them lessons on how to do an electric guitar. You get discord and fuzz and distortion, which all then becomes cultivated and gives that music even more power. So it's taking old southern Mississippi Delta powerful, explicit blues. By necessity, becomes electrified. And there you get the Chicago blues. It's the same idea. People coming from somewhere else, landing in the city, and through ingenuity and necessity, transforming something that exists into something.
You see, that's the way I think architecture ought to be looked at. When we talk about architecture, we'll start with Sullivan, or we'll start with... Whereas, if there has not been a Sullivan or some other... we would still have had skyscrapers, right? Because of necessity and all.
Let's forget about the figures. Let's go to the big picture on this thing. Forget about Sullivan. Let's take Chicago, of why things happen here. Forget about the personalities. It is a place where there was the attraction for people to come from somewhere else. Have a society of people from many different places, solving problems and necessity with kind of a practical ingenuity. combined with people who had romantic passions.
Okay.
That's the essence of Chicago.
All right.
So I don't want to say it all. In fact, if I started out by talking about Sullivan,
No,
it's people, but it's people coming from other places by circumstance in large number, which creates an interesting critical mass of a place where there isn't consensus, there isn't cohesiveness, there isn't...
Yeah, I see what you're saying.
And you deal with the specific needs of what you need to live or the opportunity to make money. And being able to, in some ways, try any kind of... And also, it's about... It's not adapting inventing anything. Nobody invents anything. It's basically ingeniously taking things from all these different cultures and places, pulling them together. So people say, "Oh, it's funny how the story of Chicago, or even architecture, like the skyscraper. It's like that old party game of telephone, where you say something to somebody and you whisper it to them at a party, and then they whisper it to the next person, and by the last person, it has nothing to do with the story." Nobody.
Well, two things, because I can't not. It's like Chicago is a Native American term, right?
Native, yes. It's a Native American term. It is, in some ways, people will debate about what it is. Either a wild onion or a wild garlic that would smell, that was in the area. And so it had this smell. And so that's where it comes from.
So it's always very striking to see how Native Americans have been somehow the I don't know how to say this. Like, they're so present while absent. Apparently the trail tracks are all apparently mainly on paths that I've heard.
Well, many of you have some of the railroad, yes. But if you go through, Chicago was laid out on a grid. Talk about practicality. It's a flat piece of land. Streets are as straight a grid as you can imagine. I grew up in a city that was on a grid. And if I go into an old city where the streets go everywhere, my head is just spinning. But there are, from the Native... Now, the interesting about the Native Americans, and I always... In fact, whenever I tell the story of Chicago, I start with them. Because they were the ones that knew all along that this was the perfect location to get anyone or anything anywhere, that the trade routes were here. It's something you lived by naturally. This was a central point. The French explorers come in the 60s and they say, "Wow, this is a great central area, and it's flat, it's great for agriculture, perfect connection for this and that." But that's something that...
they did not invent.
They did not. It's the whole idea of people that stake it. So the Native Americans are the core. Now, how were they treated in them? Why, of course, they get pushed right out of it. But there's even a building we'll go see, which actually acknowledged, when Chicago was trying to search for an indigenous identity in its architecture, where they made a building juxtaposing classical forms to show a relationship to this is the world, culture, and society, and Native American and early French exploration as the motif for decoration. So it's interesting how Chicago is struggling for what is its own indigenous identity. This one's a very outward, by symbols, looking at the past. Sullivan's wasn't about the past, although it pulls out of things in the past, but it comes from a whole other... But we'll see that.
And before we go, one last question. One thing I really don't understand. I've read, maybe that was not true, but that some of the first abolitionists were from Chicago. There was a lot of thinking that was sort of boiled down here about, abolitionism.
Yes, abolitionism. And yes, Chicago was and I think by the nature of the same nature of the city and the people who were here, it developed a very strong kind of abolitionist identity in generating publications, in the spreading of ideas. Also, a large part of the people who came to Chicago, in terms of people who lived in North America who came to Chicago, were mostly, in large part, people who came from the east across. You didn't have a lot of migration from the south up to Chicago.
But for the
for African Americans, no. When I'm talking about going back into the 19th century, when we still had a sizable African American presence here in the mid 19th century, and it was a very successful and prosperous one. But in terms of the early days of people coming to Chicago, I'm talking about the early 19th century. It was a lot of people, if you look where they come from, they're all coming from the eastern states. You don't see a lot of people coming there because they had their own economy, their own, they stayed put. Whereas the east didn't have that kind of more centralized economy of water and rail that the south had in place, generated their own. So open thinking about issues of abolition, certainly this was a good incubator for that. And also, Chicago, the one thing to remember is Chicago is this great central hub that can distribute things out. It becomes a center of printing. It becomes distribution, publication, that Chicago can then spread in the means that were effective of spreading information and ideas in the which would be published good. Chicago had a major,
was also a way for ideas to get diffused.
Yeah. I mean, even in the terms of taking it fast forwarding to the great migration of African Americans from the South, like I say, there was a sizable African American population here in the 19th century, mid-19th century. There was a special directory published in the 1880s of black professionals, of people who were engaged in professional. And these were the old settlers, who were here all along. It was still segregated. But there was still, in some areas, a kind of a more open attitude in the early days of where people were even to being given elected office in the 19th century. But fast forward to when there was the migration of people from the South, African Americans to come. A lot of that was spurred by publications like the Chicago Defender newspaper, that was Chicago in publication, national in scope, but actually spread the word about the advantages of coming to the North, emphasizing the reason why stay in the South to live under slavery. Come to Chicago. Now, when they got here, it still was a challenge. It wasn't like this was some idyllic, and they were aligned, and it actually then generated whole new social issues that caused conflict. But
and this is what I have a hard time understanding. Maybe it's very simple, but that you would get still a very segregated city.
Yes.
Here, there's a north city and there's a south.
It's a very complicated. There was the whole idea of Chicago as this very diverse place. You had early African American settlement in Chicago, and you had professionals, and it had its own community, which never got assimilated into more the Caucasian society. It stayed together, but it still had interesting interrelationships as far as where people worked and how the attitudes were. When you start to have, it was still a segregated society, but it still had more of a tie, a bit of a tie, let's say. But then you start to have the migration of people from the South. These are people coming from a different culture. The old settlers who had been here, they kind of evolved their own whole society, even though they're relatively new. And especially when you start having people coming in from places from maybe a more rural environment, even the old settlers of the African American community saw the new people coming in.
Right. We don't want them.
There was actually outreach, like setting up things like job training and manual. It was the same thing that actually you can do with other groups, where different ethnic groups would come in, and one established group would set up things like job training, like vocational training, saying, well, probably the best way for people from this group to earn a living is to like mechanical, things like. And it happened as well in the black community. It was an interesting transition in Chicago's Jewish community when it was a predominantly German Jewish community, and the Eastern European Jewish families came in, and the German Jewish communities weren't. The Eastern Europeans weren't assimilated into the existing neighborhood, but the Germans would set up like manual training schools and things. So there's always this kind of interesting leapfrog of